ang tingin nila sa amin noon, domestic worker lang kami.
They looked down on us because we were domestic workers. They thought all we did was clean houses and take care of children. They thought we did not have any type of education.
Wala kami mga pinag-aralan.
Kailangan pala i-voice out mo ang mga rights na kailangan mo.
You really have to speak out if your rights are being violated. You just can't sit and do nothing about your situation.
Kailangan pala mag-i-strive ka. Hihingin mo.
You have to demand your rights.
When you are right, you will get it.
Of course, frustrated kami, disappointed. But yung supporters namin are very positive. We were positive also. Sabi namin then, the more we have to fight.
Ang daming mga...
We were warned all the time. Even my cousins warned me about going to jail and being deported if I supported the rally. That was one of the reasons I couldn't force some of my friends to join.
Kukulong nila kayo, work permit ka, hindi kayo landed immigrant.
I was given the right to work in Canada, then automatically I should be given the right to stay in Canada. Okay, not a forever domestic worker, but the right as a human being.
Equal rights, equal work.
In 1981, 6 domestic workers from the Philippines led a group of Filipinas who challenged unfair labor and immigration laws in the struggle for domestic workers' rights in Canada.
Equal rights, good enough to work, good enough.
This is their story.
Sincere. There is nothing impossible.
It breaks my heart, you know.
If we are good enough to work here, then we are good enough to stay.
It was the 1970s, a time of action and defiance in North America. And like their neighbors down south, there was a sense among Canadians that change could only be achieved if they demanded it. In Toronto, the first ever public protest for gay and lesbian rights was staged in the summer of 1971. And across the country, Native people continued their fight to reclaim lands their ancestors once owned. The decade also saw the women's rights movement gain momentum, and an enormous shift in the labor market took place. For the first time since the Second World War, Canadian women were entering the workforce, contributing economically, socially, and politically. The housewife and the stay-at-home mom became dying breeds, and the demand for domestic workers increased tenfold. As a response, the federal government introduced a program which allowed women from the Caribbean, Europe, and Asia to work as nannies, caregivers, and household help in Canada. It was no surprise then that Tessie Rayo, an X-ray technician, Lohrie Rosas, a recent college graduate, Linda Lising, an administrative assistant, Ving Domingo, a former fashion show producer and a young mother of 3, and Coco Diaz, a social worker, would find themselves working as domestic help in Toronto in the early 1980s.
Sa katotohanan, very uncertain kung ano ang maging kahinatnan ng buhay ko doon. Lalo yung
My future in the Philippines was very uncertain. As a social worker, I counseled a lot of people who were struggling and saw a lot of poverty firsthand. I didn't want to end up that way.
If I had had a choice, I would have stayed in the Philippines. It's not easy leaving your family, but
I had no choice. There was no future back home.
The Philippines had been in an economic crisis ever since its president, Ferdinand Marcos, declared martial law on the small island nation in 1972. Under the guise of his vision of a new society, Marcos dissolved Congress, took over all media outlets, and jailed thousands of political dissidents. He then seized major corporations, utility companies, and private properties, and handed control of them over to his many friends and relatives. The rich became richer, and the poor drowned in even deeper poverty.
Pinakamahirap na parte ng buhay ko.
Becoming a domestic worker was one of the hardest things to accept.
Sa Pilipinas, hanggang mapapaaral ka ng magulang mo.
After all, my parents had put me through school, gave me a comfortable life, and expected so much from me.
Sa atin, di ba, katulong? O in short, alila. Napakahirap.
Siyempre, nagagamba.
Of course I was worried about what's going to happen.
That part is hard itself. Kasi shooting in the dark.
I don't know what's waiting for us there. It's like shooting in the dark.
Ang pinakamahirap, nung umalis ako, nung nakita ko yung anak ko na...
The hardest part was seeing my 18-month-old daughter crying the night before I left. She didn't sleep. She knew that I was leaving and cried the whole night.
Yun ang pinakamasakit sa akin.
That was the hardest part, seeing her cry like that.
And, like thousands of Filipinas who came to Canada in search of a better life for themselves and their loved ones, Ving, Lohrie, Tessie, Alinda, and Coco were immediately faced with the cold, hard truth about life as a domestic worker in a foreign land. On a warm Sunday afternoon in the spring of 1980, some 70 Filipina domestic workers converged at the Ecumenical Forum in Toronto. They came at the request of the International Association of Filipino Patriots, the IAFP, whose members were concerned that stories of abuse and exploitation of domestic workers were on the rise. Fely Villasin, their staunch and vocal leader, knew it was time to take action.
Napansin na namin yung bakit dumadami yung kababaihan na dumadami.
Since 1978, we noticed a growing number of Filipinas coming here without their families. We wanted to know what their needs were and what we could do to help. So our initial meetings with domestic workers were all about gathering and sharing information.
Joining her on the panel was a young activist lawyer from the Law Union of Ontario named Cathy Laird, one of a handful of lawyers who were willing to enlighten domestic workers about legal questions that could confront them.
As a lawyer, I knew that I didn't want to go to Bay Street, so I was always looking to try to find where I could do a legal practice that would be of some benefit to maybe people who were socially excluded or disadvantaged.
Also there that day was political activist Ging Hernandez, Fely's knowledgeable accomplice at the IAFP.
Maraming taon dumating, siguro mga 80.
A lot of people came, 70 or 80 people. We were surprised. We thought we were lucky if 20 people showed up. They came from different parts of the Philippines, different professional backgrounds and experiences.
One of the subjects on the agenda that evening was a discussion on domestic workers' rights.
We wanted to inform them of their rights even if they were only here temporarily, even if they did not have landed status.
Then Cathy Laird startles the crowd when she yells, "You have no rights in Canada."
Nagulat yung mga kababaihan sapagkat akala nila.
The women were stunned. They thought because they worked here, they had rights like any other Canadian worker.
Unang-una, hindi sila...
First, they were not protected under any current labor laws. They were not included at all. As a result, employers paid them whatever they wanted to pay them.
They couldn't take holidays or take a vacation, and they were not allowed to call in sick.
Very common for employers not to come home when they said they would come home, just to assume that they would work all weekend. Even if they thought they had the weekend off and had made arrangements to go out with friends at the last minute, they'd have to stay. If the kid got sick, it wouldn't be the parent that would stay home with the kid, it would be the nanny, even if it was her time off.
One of the conditions of the Foreign Domestic Workers Program was the highly controversial live-in clause, which stated that foreign domestics must live with their employers during their tenure in Canada.
When a domestic worker arrived in Canada, her employer literally became her guardian. Their names had to be on her working permit. If she had a disagreement with them and wanted to quit, she couldn't. And if she managed to quit, the only job she was allowed to take was domestic work.
You have to be there all the time. You can't go anywhere without asking for permission. Not even to the mall if you want to buy something.
It truly was amazing when grown people, adults, were hired because they were educated and qualified, and yet were not allowed to decide where they could live. They had to live with their employers while they worked for them.
An arrangement that, more often than not, contributed to numerous cases of abuse and exploitation. While most employers treated their domestic workers with the utmost respect, many took advantage of their roles as masters to their indentured servants.
Well, the examples were boundless of women who were brought to Canada, were placed in an employer's home. In the early days, they could work literally 7 days a week, be on call 24 hours a day.
And they didn't work 7 days a week from 9 to 5. They worked from whatever the earliest imaginable hour you can think of in the morning, and then they babysat children at night while the employers went out.
One of my friends had to care for her employer's child, their parents, and 3 dogs. She had no idea she would be doing all this when she signed the contract.
In fact, this is awful to say, although perhaps it's still continuing, that instead of referring to a Filipina nanny by her name, it was like my Filipina. It became almost an object. Maybe my Filipina can take your children as well,
There were also numerous cases, probably far more than we were ever aware of women who were sexually harassed by their employers. These women had no recourse whatsoever.
There's nothing you can do. You had no choice because you're a live-in domestic worker.
Live-in also meant that they had to stay in Canada until their contracts expired, or they ran the risk of losing their work permits and not being allowed back in. This was especially hard for Ving, who was confronted with the possibility of not seeing her husband and 3 children for as long as 3 years.
Nahirapan ako mag-adjust dahil sa mga anak ko.
I really had a hard time adjusting because I missed my kids so much. Every time I saw children playing, I cried.
Ang isang karahasan na lahat ng mga Pilipinang
From our many conversations with them, we found out one of the worst experiences domestic workers had to deal with was being away from their families, especially if they had children back home.
Mga magulang. Mas madalas pa yun kaysa yung...
For them, this was worse than being sexually or physically abused.
It breaks my heart, Pero...
But I had to do this. I had to make sacrifices. I was doing this for my kids, and that's what I thought about when I felt lonely.
In the winter of 1980, Tessie was rushed to the hospital after falling ill during a dinner celebrating her birthday.
We were eating in a restaurant and suddenly I felt that.
I was vomiting a lot. I felt like I was going insane.
Rushed me to the hospital. Yung session na psychiatrist na ano niya dun sa...
I saw the psychiatrist, and from what he told me, he said I was worried about the uncertainty of my future in Canada.
Kulang ang sweldo, mali sweldo, mahabang-mahaba ang oras, o walang...
They were underpaid and overworked.
Pwede kang gisingin.
They were on call 24 hours a day. However, this wasn't the toughest part about being a domestic worker. The toughest part was not being able to stay in Canada after your contract expired.
We had zero chance of becoming immigrants.
In those days, domestic workers were given a 3-year work permit and then sent back home. On the other hand, there was no shortage of foreign doctors, nurses, teachers, and engineers entering the country with permanent resident or landed immigrant status.
Yun ang naging yun ang pinakamalakas na motibo.
This injustice, this inequality was the main reason, the sole motivating factor why women became involved in the fight for domestic workers' rights.
Because if they come in as immigrants, they get a social insurance card the same as every other immigrant or Canadian. They can have their children with them. Their children can attend school. It doesn't cause a hardship.
I was given the right to work in Canada, then I should be given the right to stay in Canada.
Good enough to stay. Good enough to work. Good enough to stay. Good enough to work. Good enough to stay. Landed status now. Landed status now. Landed status now. Landed status now.
The concept of landed status for domestic workers was not new. It first surfaced in the 1970s when 7 Jamaican mothers who were ordered deported because they did not disclose that they had children back in Jamaica fought to have their deportation order stayed.
So ang nangyari,
So the women got organized,
yung mga workers
found representation from the legal community here, and rejected the government's deportation order. In fact, a lot of Canadian women supported the cause, and I believe it was the first time that domestic workers came together and took action. It was also the first time the public became aware of the plight of migrant women workers in Canada.
The attention generated by the Jamaican mothers would not be enough, however, to turn heads in Ottawa, the official home of the federal government. To do this, the campaign needed the participation of the Filipinas, one of the largest domestic workers groups in Canada. And, thanks to Kathy Laird's wake-up call, they were slowly becoming interested in their rights, or their lack thereof.
I think in a way I did want it to shock people into realizing that they should and could make a stand, that they could name that fact, that they could say, we have no rights, we should have rights. Then that was empowering to them, and I think it got them going, it got them interested in the fight.
With backing from activists Hernandez, Villasin, and Ruben Cusipag, the publisher of the Filipino newspaper Balita, it didn't take long until Tessie, Lohrie, Ving, Linda, and Coco got their feet wet, volunteering what little time they had left at events and activities that promoted the struggle. Linda would take her involvement further when she is elected president of the Philippine Ladies Circle, one of the biggest Filipino domestic workers support groups in Ontario. It would be Coco, however, who would be the first to stir up passions among Filipinas when she suggested that they take a radical action. At a meeting sponsored by the Filipino Homemakers Association, or the FHA, an increasingly frustrated Coco noticed that important issues such as domestic workers' rights or the push for landed status were not being discussed.
They talked about the profits from the last dance. They talked about their plans for the summer. I noticed that all they talked about was social matters. I suggested that we talk about more important issues, like fighting for the right to have permanent status. There were lots of ideas thrown around. Some said we should hold meetings. Some said to gather signatures for petitions, and some said to get the support of the community first.
Pero, palagay ko, mas
I told them their ideas were all great, but to attract more attention and to make a bigger impact, we should stage a rally.
Sabi kong ganon. Marami yung...
The room was silent, like a bomb just dropped.
Tita Holly, a former domestic worker and president of the FHA, immediately rejected the idea.
Hindi ito political na organisasyon.
She said they were not a political organization and were only concerned about the social needs of the group. She then added that if the rally went ahead, the Filipino Homemakers Association would not be participating.
Unbeknownst to Holly, other domestic workers in attendance took notice of Coco's bold idea, including Zeny Dumlao, one of the FHA's highest-ranking members. Villasin, who was there that evening, smiled secretly amongst the crowd. Filipinas, she thought, have finally broken out of their shells. The time had come to take the fight to the streets.
Equal work, equal rights, equal work, equal rights, equal work, equal rights, equal work, equal rights.
On May 21st, 1981, a small but lively group of Filipinas, including Tessie, Coco, Linda, Lohrie, Ving, and the FHA's Zeny Dumlao, joined forces with domestic workers from other parts of the world for a rally in front of the Canadian Immigration Office in Toronto.
Ang turnout ng unang rally.
Unfortunately, the turnout was small.
There were about 17 or 18 protesters. 14 were foreign domestic workers. The rest were Canadian supporters.
Equal rights, equal work, equal rights, equal work, equal rights.
Each one of us
tried very hard to encourage people, especially domestic workers, to come out and join us. But they didn't show up. Nobody came.
I talked to some domestic workers and they said that they were scared to show their support because they knew what happened in the Philippines if you participated in movements like this. There was a real chance that something bad could happen to you.
You can't blame them because they were really scared that if immigration found out they were involved in something like this, they'd be sent home.
You go home.
Still, the seeds had been planted. Some might not have marched or carried signs or clenched their fists, but they were there.
Merong mga dumadaan lang, mga kababaihan.
Some of them stayed inside their cars and just drove by. Some stayed at the bottom of stairs by the subway station and peeked in from time to time.
Some stopped by and read our signs. Some just walked through the protest.
Para sa amin, okay na yun dahil talagang...
They may not have been as informed or as determined as the other domestic workers, but knowing they were there was very important to us.
Noticeably missing from the rally were leaders and representatives from the growing Filipino community.
Marami sa mga liderato sa Filipino community ang...
Most of the leaders of the Filipino community did nothing to help the struggle. Worse, some discouraged other domestics from joining the fight. They would convince them not to join the protests and branded them as being activists and communists if they did.
Magaling sila sa pagtinda ng kanilang mga insurance.
They were only good for selling insurance, pots and pans, and whatever else they sold to newly arrived domestic workers. They really took advantage of the situation. They paid for their cars and homes off the blood, sweat, and tears of domestic workers who supported their businesses.
The lack of support was merely a reflection of the attitudes of many Filipinos towards domestic workers.
One
thing that hurt the most was the way Filipinos here looked at us. We were regarded with disdain and ridicule.
They thought we did not have any type of education. What they didn't know was that most domestic workers who came here were professionals in the Philippines.
When we attended parties, They stared at us and called us chimay, the slur word for domestic workers.
Yung nagkaroon ng Philippine Independence Celebration sa Seton Park.
I remember I asked this older Filipino lady at a picnic to sign one of our petitions. She shrugged me off and said, "I have to go. I just lost my appetite."
Ay nako, makaalis ka, nawalan ako ng...
Those were some of the kind of responses we got, just because we were domestic workers.
Nagpapapirma.
News of the rally traveled fast and reached the desk of Lloyd Axworthy, the fair but thorough Minister of Employment and Immigration.
My attitude towards immigration was the more we could attract good people, the better off we were. That was not necessarily a prevalent point of view. There was always a pushback saying, oh, there's too many coming or it's changing the face of the country. Well, to me, that was a good thing.
He wasn't convinced, however, that foreign domestic workers were entitled to automatic landed immigrant status.
In a way, the domestic workers were skipping the queue in one real sense. That they were saying, okay, we're coming here to work in the domestic vocations. So we don't have to go through the normal procedures of getting in the line and meeting other criteria.
Despite his views, he agreed to meet with domestic workers in Ottawa to hear them plead their case. As important as this milestone was, it was obvious to Villasin that most domestic workers would not be able to make the 5-hour trek to the capital. Their employers would not have allowed it. So she came to a logical conclusion. Why not form a group that would represent Filipino domestics, not just in Ottawa, but throughout the whole campaign? In the spring of 1981, the Ad Hoc Committee for Landed Status was formed. The idea was to have actual domestic workers serve as officers in the committee, a true grassroots movement.
Ang pagpili ng mga miyembro ng Ad Hoc.
We needed women who were willing to work tirelessly for the campaign, day in and day out, women of action.
Ang mga kababaihan ng nagpresenta.
So we left it up to them to volunteer their time and services.
Araw-araw.
Without a moment's hesitation, Linda, Coco, Tessie, Ving, and Zeny quickly signed up and were immediately put to task. Linda was designated treasurer, while Coco would take on the role of liaison. The trio of Tessie, Ving, and Zeny oversaw communication and networking. Known as the Ad Hoc Executive Committee members, they became the core of the newly formed group. Villasin, providing much-needed guidance and leadership, was tagged the unofficial convener of the committee.
Si Fely.
Fely was the catalyst of the group, the one who started it all. She supported us. She encouraged us.
Ang role is...
We gave Fely our full support. Whatever we could for the struggle, planning, writing, and campaigning. We were there to support her.
Lohrie passed up on executive positions, but along with domestic workers Cora Manuel, Chit Ramos, Linda Corpus, and Ophelia Gascon, became 5 of the group's most ardent supporters.
We are just supporters sa kanila.
We worked behind the scenes. We used to say to other domestics,
while you were sleeping, we were working for the struggle.
Once again, young lawyers like Nancy Goodman, Barb Jackman, Kathy Laird, and Shin Imai offered their services free of charge.
One of the things that was important for us as progressive lawyers was to give support to groups like the foreign domestic workers, so we were just open to doing that.
Alliances were quickly formed with groups such as Intercede, the International Coalition to End Domestics Exploitation, led by Judith Ramirez and Francis Gregory.
What happened was that Intercede was doing some work, and we were contacted by some Filipino activists and who understood this as one of the most significant issues, I think, for the Filipino community.
Filipino organizations that had supported the struggle since the beginning, such as the Coalition Against the Marcos Dictatorship, the IAFP, and the Kababayan Community Center, renewed their commitment to the fight. Not to mention Hernandez and Kusipag, who had already pledged unconditional support whenever and wherever it was needed.
These are the people who were so proud and always willing to be of assistance to us or guide us before.
On June 8, 1981, as part of a delegation that included lawyers and domestic workers groups from Toronto, Vancouver, and Montreal, Coco, Zeny, and Ving proudly represented the Ad Hoc Committee for Landed Status in Ottawa. Barb Jackman was one of the lawyers who were present at the meeting that day.
I think most of the women in the room were actually domestic workers. And the senior bureaucrats would say things like that it wasn't true that women couldn't have their children live with them even while they were domestic workers. And two women in the room would stand up and say, I've been trying for 5 years. Like they could speak to direct experience. And that was probably the most powerful meeting I think I've been in.
To everyone's disappointment, however, the decision on the landed status issue and other changes would be delayed.
I just simply wanted to ensure that when I went to Cabinet to get the regulations changed, that I could demonstrate that there was a viable and a sincere and widespread commitment by the domestic workers themselves to support the regulation and also to make the case that they've earned the responsibility to become good citizens.
The women decided that a more drastic action was needed to sway Axworthy, one that could risk their entire futures in Canada. The committee received a tip that the minister would be in town for a dinner meeting with members of the Chinese business community.
He was going to have a dinner sa Saiwo restaurant that is in Dandans and Espadina.
So naisip namin na
we thought it would have been a good idea to present the signed petitions we had been collecting to the minister.
So habang ginagawa yun, nasa labas kami.
We planned a course of action. While we protested outside, we sent 2 women at a time inside the restaurant. We were being cautious after all. It was a private property.
Politiko. Second is politiko yan, high official ng government.
Plus, it was an official government function, and we didn't have the right to be there. The women were scared, but showed a lot of courage and went in.
We went to the minister's table and handed him the signed petitions. We wanted him to know that we meant business.
He was surprised. He never expected that in his quiet dinner, there's this active women from the Filipino community who will go and interrupt yung dinner niya.
Isa yan sa mga
This was one of the proudest moments of the ad hoc committee because of how fast we acted on the tip and how quickly we got organized and then handing Lloyd Axworthy the signed petitions.
What I was surprised by was the size of the petition. I mean, they really done a lot of work. So that was a little bit of a turning point. I think it kind of crystallized things for me.
Not content to rest on their laurels, Fely announced plans for a second protest to remind Axworthy that they would not rest until a decision was made. The rally cry would be received warmly, but again, Tita Holly dissuaded members of her group, the Filipino Homemakers Association, from joining the protest. In an article in one of the Filipino newspapers, Holly defended her decision to oppose the planned rally. In it, she stated that domestic workers in Canada were a whole lot better off than their counterparts in other countries because of the protection that Canadian laws offer them.
Para sa akin yung statement niya yon is not relative to all of the domestic
She was married to a Canadian citizen, and any changes to the immigration policy would not affect her. That statement only applied to women who were fortunate enough to be in her situation.
Dr. Francisco Portugal, a prominent member of the community and sometimes unofficial advisor to some Filipino organizations, also followed Hallie's lead.
Sabi niya sa akin, huwag kayong mag-join kasi the more you...
He told me not to go because it was disruptive. Besides, he said, if you mix earth with water, you end up with mud.
Haluan mo ng...
I assumed he was referring to the activists who were supporting us.
magkukulay malabo.
Despite objections from their many detractors, plans went ahead for what Fely hoped would be a bigger, better, and stronger rally.
Kailangan maigting lalo ang paglaban kontra sa
We have to increase the pressure on the government to allow domestic workers to enter Canada as landed immigrants.
Dito na wala silang status, wala silang karapatan talaga eh. Maski may karapatan sila, hindi nila
This is the only way they are assured that they will have rights once they land here.
Nakukuha yung mga pangangailangan nila, mga karapatan nila.
Good enough to work. Good enough to stay. Good enough to work. Good enough to stay. Good enough to work.
Apparently, our type of job is of great demand. Yet we are the lowest paid workers. Exploited, uncertain of status, excluded from some legislative protection. We do not enjoy the same benefits and privileges as other workers. Therein lies the discrimination in the federal policy.
About 200 domestic servants marched in two cities today, Vancouver and Toronto. They marched to protest against Canada's immigration laws. They're fighting for the right to stay here. Lorraine Kimmel reports.
These women represent thousands of
On November 22nd, 1981, braving freezing temperatures, domestic workers from all over the world gathered at the steps of immigration offices in Toronto and Vancouver and demanded that the government grant them landed immigrant status in Canada. In Toronto, television cameras circled the protesters, while newspaper photographers snapped shots the whole day. Cars honked their horns as they passed by. But the most impressive sight was the number of Filipina domestic workers that marched up and down in support of their ad hoc sisters.
Why is it that you would like to be a landed immigrant?
Just to have a security.
At the second rally, you could sense that the women were much more confident. The first rally helped them overcome a lot of fear, and more people showed up to protest.
We saw women from the Philippines, a lot from the Caribbean as well, and from other countries.
Delia Diaz was one who characterized the determination of many Filipina domestic workers who wanted to show their support towards the ad hoc committee.
Excited.
We were very excited. I remember that there were 13 of us inside this van that was only supposed to seat 7. We were packed like sardines, but we didn't care. We weren't going to miss that rally.
Sa loob eh. Isa niya kami pinipick up.
Wilson Head, a leader in the black community, and Judith Ramirez of Intercede yelled words of encouragement as domestic workers from the Caribbean, Europe, and the Philippines proudly walked side by side.
Ito na yung pinaka-importante nilang aktibidad, ano?
This rally was the largest and most significant event that the ad hoc committee ever staged. About 100 protesters were there, most of them Filipinas.
Sa kakabuti natin, kailangan ipaglaban natin lahat.
For our sake, we needed to fight for our rights. We had to be given an opportunity to become landed immigrants. We suffered enough and sacrificed a lot. It was time we had a better life.
Equal work, equal rights, equal work, equal rights, equal work, equal rights.
On November 26, 1981, Minister Axworthy introduced the Foreign Domestics Movement Program, a program that would allow foreign domestics who had been in the country for 2 years to apply for landed immigrant status from within Canada.
Sa madaling salita, hindi na...
In short, they are no longer forced to go home as long as they honor their contract and meet government requirements.
Kung nakarating sila dito, nagsilbi sila na...
They can now apply for permanent residency status.
Makukuha na nila yung pamilya nila.
They now have a chance to become Canadian citizens.
Canadian na sila.
I was so happy. I was so energetic, and I jump, and we I made phone calls, and then see, it's like, but thing is, I cried because like I pity ourselves who work hard for it, and now we succeeded.
I was very, very happy. All I could think of was being able to bring my children here.
It's an overwhelming feeling because it's the start of the dream.
It was a new beginning. We could plan our lives.
We were proud to be domestic workers because marami kaming natutunan and so forth. But syempre hindi yun ang klase na.
But it wasn't something we planned on doing all our lives.
All throughout our lives.
Well, that is the consummation of all the hard labors and expectations and aspirations. So, hallelujah. What can I say?
If we are good enough to work here, then we are good enough to stay.
They're right. They had earned their right, and that there was no reason to say that you've been asked to take on one of the most valuable vocations, helping look after children. But there's no reason why you shouldn't be given the right and the entitlement to then apply.
The campaign not only gave foreign domestic workers the opportunity to become landed immigrants, it also paved the way towards better employment protection standards and inclusion in the Workmen's Compensation Act, a first for foreign workers in Canada.
It's hard to, I guess it's hard to express how you feel about a community like that, but it's a courageous community because when you think of it, not one of them had permanent status in Canada. All of them stood to face problems with renewal of their visas and could have been removed from Canada, and yet they still pushed.
If you think about what they had to contend with, they challenged the government of Canada. They faced politicians and ministers, and they did not have the full support of the Filipino community. It was scary, but still, they fought on.
I do believe na if you are really sincere to what you want to happen, plus there will be determination, hard work, and with the support from the people, there is nothing impossible. Yeah.
These women, I think, were sort of the groundswell for immigration patterns from a number of different countries. Had it not been for the domestic workers, many of the people who now make Canada their home would never have been able to come.
Of course. Yeah, of course. All of us. Kahit yung mga pumapasok dito ngayon. All of us. We owe them a lot.
Napakalaking kontribusyon ng mga Pilipina sa...
It's immeasurable. You can't put a price on the contributions made by Filipina domestic workers towards the struggle to end discrimination against migrant workers. It's immeasurable.
Good enough to stay. Good enough to work. Good enough to stay. Good enough to work. Good enough to stay.
Linda Lising became a Canadian citizen in 1986 and is now a law clerk for the Alcohol and Gaming Commission of Ontario. More importantly, she was able to buy her parents a beautiful home in the Philippines and put all her siblings through graduate school. Tessie Rayo resumed her career as an X-ray technician in Toronto. She shares a lovely home with Lohrie Rosas, who now works for a mortgage company. Both were able to sponsor family members to Canada after becoming citizens in 1986. Coco Diaz continues her work, helping Filipino domestics as a full-time counselor at Intercede, the international coalition to end domestics exploitation. She is happily married and blessed with twin sons and a beautiful daughter. She became a Canadian citizen in 1985. Ving Domingo was finally reunited with her 3 children in 1986, 2 years after becoming a citizen. Divorced, remarried, and now widowed, she has 4 wonderful grandchildren and another one on the way, all of them Canadian citizens.
I still remember how hard it was for us to live in the Philippines and the struggles that we had to go through. Even me at 6, I remember. And I remember to this day, and I'm so thankful that Mommy worked so hard. To bring us here. Sorry, I can't.
Boa, 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 boa.